The Lord of Iron Vale had never crossed the threshold of a servant's kitchen. Not once in 7 years of rule. Yet, there he stood at dawn, silver eyes fixed on a girl with flower-dusted hands and a secret older than his own bloodline. Behind the keep's stone walls, an enemy had already mapped every shadow, every unlocked door, every unguarded minute. A transfer order bearing a stolen name. Skeleton keys forged from inside knowledge. 14 minutes between patrol and gate, 14 minutes to take everything. But Edron Vale moved first. Not for his territory. Not for his keep. For her. Why would the most feared lord in the realm risk everything? Not for power, not for land, but for one invisible girl no one had ever bothered to see. Watch until the end to uncover the truth hidden behind these ancient walls. The cold came first. It always did in the northern halls of Ashkeep. Before the hunger, before the exhaustion, before the particular kind of loneliness that settles into a person's bones, like frost into stone, Ilara had learned to feel the cold as a warning, the way animals feel the shift in current before a river flood. It meant something was about to change. It meant she needed to be still, invisible, small. She pressed her back against the rough stone wall of the corridor, fingers curled around a wooden tray that held a single clay cup of broth and a half loaf of bread. Dinner, tight. For a girl who carried the name of the keep's lowest ranked servant, dinner was never warm. The broth had stopped steaming somewhere between the kitchens and the east passage. She could smell it, watery, thin, barely seasoned. Around it floated the heavier scent of the keep itself. Riverwood smoke from the hearths. Melted tallow from the torches set into iron brackets along the walls. The faint metallic tang of something old embedded in the stone. Ashkeep smelled like centuries of power, and Ilara had always been careful not to breathe too deeply, as if the place might notice her lungs and decide she didn't deserve the air. She was 22 years old. She had lived within these walls for 6 of those years. Not as a knight, not as a ranked member of the Iron Veil Order, but as something the keep's hierarchy had never bothered to properly name. Orphaned without standing, useful only in the ways a quiet pair of hands can be useful. She kept her auburn hair braided tight and covered with a plain linen wrap when she worked, which was always. Her dress was gray wool, mended at the hem with darker thread that didn't quite match. Her boots had been someone else's once, slightly too wide, the left sole beginning to separate at the toe, which she'd stitched back with waxed cord 3 times already. She was not pretty in the way the ranked ladies were pretty, arranged and deliberate. She was pretty the way something enduring is pretty, the way a riverstone is, worn smooth by time and pressure, shaped by everything that had tried to break her. She was almost to the corridor's end when she heard them. Voices low, heavy with authority, coming from the great hall and coming closer. Ilara stopped walking. She pressed the tray to her chest, instinctively, as though she could make herself even smaller than she already was. She looked left. A doorway half open, leading to a storeroom. She could reach it in 4 steps if she moved now. She didn't move fast enough. The great hall's double doors swung open, and the corridor filled with the kind of presence that precedes a lord paramount, the way thunder precedes a storm breaking over the river. She felt it in her chest first. A pressure drop, a shift in the air that made the torches along the wall shiver. Edron Vale crossed the threshold, and the corridor became a different place entirely. He was tall in a way that the word tall fails to properly describe. Broad at the shoulder, everything about him composed and contained, as though the violence he was capable of had been folded neatly and stored somewhere just beneath the surface. He wore dark riding leathers, still damp at the collar from an evening patrol. A heavy cloak of charcoal gray wool thrown over one shoulder and fastened with a black iron clasp at his chest. His hair was dark, pushed back from his face, and his jaw was sharp enough to cast its own shadow in the torchlight. His eyes were pale, almost silver, and they moved the way a predator's eyes move, cataloging every corner of every room before the rest of him had fully entered it. Behind him walked 2 of his inner circle. Ro, his second, dark-skinned and built, like a man who had never lost a fight, his expression always somewhere between bored and dangerous. And Sorn, the keep's head enforcer, leaner, quieter, a long scar running from his left ear to his jaw. Ilara should have stepped aside immediately. She knew the protocol. She'd followed it for 6 years without a single mistake. But the bread slipped. It was nothing. A slight tilt of the tray, a half loaf sliding toward the edge. Her hand shot out to catch it, and in doing so, the clay cup of broth rocked, sloshed, and sent a thin stream of pale liquid spilling across the stone floor directly in front of where Edrin Vale was walking. The sound of his boots stopped. Silence in that corridor was not like ordinary silence. It was a held breath. It was Ro's hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the short blade at his belt. It was Sorn going very, very still. Ilara crouched immediately, setting the tray on the floor, using the rough edge of her apron to mop up the spill. Her hands were steady. She'd learned that much, how to keep her hands steady when everything else was loud. "Stand up." The voice was low, not loud. It didn't need to be. She stood. She met his eyes because looking away felt more dangerous than looking directly at something dangerous. His gaze moved over her face with an efficiency that was somehow worse than contempt. It was assessment. The way you look at something to determine its function. "You work in the East Kitchens," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my lord." "Your name?" A pause. Not because she'd forgotten it. Because name spoken in front of a lord paramount became thing. "Ilara, my lord." Something in his expression shifted. Almost nothing. Barely a fraction. And then it settled back into stone. He looked at the tray on the floor, at the bread, at the clay cup now half empty. Then he looked back at her face, and whatever calculation he was running inside that silver gaze finished, because he simply stepped around the spill, nodded once at something she couldn't interpret, and continued walking. Ro followed without a word. Sorn paused for half a second longer than necessary, glancing at her with something that might have been curiosity, and then he too was gone. Ilara crouched back down, picked up the tray, steadied the cup. Her hands, she noticed for the first time, were trembling. She didn't know why. She had done nothing wrong. She had answered his questions. She had not looked away. She had survived the encounter the way she survived everything, quietly, carefully, leaving no mark. But something about the way he had said her name, Ilara, not as though it were beneath him, not with the particular flavor of disdain she'd grown so accustomed to from the ranked members of Ashkeep, but flatly, like he was filing it somewhere he intended to find again. That was the thing making her hands shake. She stood. She straightened. She walked back to the east passage with the cold broth and the rescued bread. Behind her, somewhere in the deep stone architecture of the keep, a door closed. The sound echoed for longer than it should have. She didn't look back, but she thought about the way those silver eyes had moved across her face, and she thought with a certainty that frightened her, that he had seen something she'd spent 6 years learning to hide. Chapter 2. Morning at Ashkeep arrived with the smell of river birch and fresh bread and always the sound of the training yard. Ilara had been awake since before the first light. She'd lit the kitchen hearths herself, a task that required 2 trips to the woodpile in the yard. Arms full of split birch that left sap on her palms and a pleasant ache in her shoulders. She liked the mornings. Before the keep woke fully, before the hierarchy of the order reasserted itself like a physical force in every room, there were a few quiet hours that belonged to nobody in particular. She could move through them without adjusting herself to fit anyone else's expectation. The head cook, a heavy-set woman named Berta, arrived as Ilara was setting the first round of loaves near the hearth to rise. Berta was not cruel. She was, in the specific language of Ashkeep, simply indifferent, which in Ilara's experience was almost kinder. Indifference didn't require anything from her. It didn't ask her to shrink in particular ways or perform gratitude she didn't feel. "The Lord's Council meets tonight," Berta said, hanging her apron on the iron hook by the door. "Full spread in the Great Hall. You'll be serving." Elara didn't flinch. "Of course. There will be visitors." Berta said it the way people say things they've been told to say, but don't enjoy saying. "Delegates from the Ashfin Lordship." The word moved through the kitchen like a draft from an open window. Elara kept her hands working, shaping dough, pressing it, turning it, and kept her expression still. But she heard it, the thing under the word. Ashfin, the Western Lordship, Edron Vale's oldest rival territory. A domain currently led by a man whose name moved through Ashkeep's corridors, the way a bad smell moves, unavoidably, and with a particular kind of unease attached to it. Aldrich Vane, Lord of the Western Reaches, younger than Edron by a handful of years, and precisely the kind of man who made older, more careful men nervous. Ambitious. Charming by all accounts. Willing to smile while he measured the distance between himself and your throat. "How many delegates?" Elara asked. 6, plus the Lord himself. So Aldrich Vane was coming personally. She thought about that while she worked. She thought about the council chamber, its long table of dark wood, the iron candelabras, the particular choreography of power that happened when two lords occupied the same room. She'd served enough of those dinners to understand the mechanics, who sat where, who poured whose wine first, the calculated casualness of every gesture. She'd also, in 6 years, learned something the ranked members of Ashkeep hadn't bothered to notice about her. She watched. She listened. She remembered things. It was Mira who found her at midday, appearing in the kitchen doorway with flour on her sleeve, and that particular brightness in her expression that meant she had information she was impatient to share. Mira was 19, slight, with dark curly hair and the kind of face that people trusted immediately and shouldn't always. She was one of the few people in Ashkeep who had chosen, deliberately and despite considerable social risk, to be Elara's friend. "You heard about tonight?" Mira said. "I'm serving." "Then you'll see him." Mira pulled a stool to the work table and sat, lowering her voice out of habit. "Aldrich Vane. They say he's here to propose a territorial agreement. Something about the eastern meadowlands near the river bend." "They always frame it as something practical," Elara said. "Yes, well." Mira picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. Roe told Soren, who told the understeward, who apparently told half the East Wing. Aldrich Vane has been pressing for a formal alliance for 2 years. Edron has refused twice. This is the 3rd meeting. Why would he agree now? Mira glanced toward the doorway, checking the passage beyond. Because Aldrich isn't coming alone this time. He's bringing a signed compact from 3 smaller lordships on the western border. Combined, they control enough territory to make refusing complicated. Elara set down the dough. She looked at Mira. "He's creating leverage." "He's creating a problem," Mira corrected softly. "And Edron doesn't like problems he didn't design himself." That evening, dressed in the formal serving clothes the East Wing staff wore for council events, a dark linen dress, better fitted than her usual gray wool, her braid pinned up and covered, Elara carried the first platters into the great hall and understood immediately that tonight was different. The great hall of Ashkeep was designed to make guests feel the weight of what they were standing in front of. High stone walls, tapestries in deep burgundy and iron gray, the long council table set with iron candlesticks, and the keep's crest carved into the wood at its head. A fire burned in the great hearth at the room's end, and the smell of it, river birch rendered to coals, something spiced in the mulled wine already poured, filled the room with a warmth that was almost hospitable. Almost. Edron sat at the head of the table. He had changed from his riding leathers. Now he wore a deep charcoal doublet, collar unbuttoned by one, the same black iron clasp at his shoulder. He was not leaning forward, He was not performing ease. He simply sat the way he stood and stood the way he moved, as though the space around him had quietly agreed to organize itself according to his preferences. Across the table, 3 seats down on the left, sat Aldrich Vane. Elara noticed him the way you notice fire when you enter a cold room. Instinctively, immediately. He was lighter than Edrin in every sense, lighter coloring, lighter expression, a warmth in his features that his counterpart completely lacked. He was laughing at something his own delegate had said, head tilted back slightly, completely at ease in a hall that was not his, and a seat that had been deliberately positioned 2 ranks below the head. He was performing comfort. Elara understood the difference. His eyes moved to her as she set the platter of roasted meat at the table's center, and he smiled. Not predatory, not dismissive. A smile that seemed to say, "I see you. Isn't that interesting?" Elara looked away, set down the platter, stepped back to the wall. Across the table, she did not look at the head of the table, but she felt, with a precision she couldn't entirely explain, that Edrin had been watching. Chapter 3. 3 days passed before Elara understood what Aldrich Vane was actually doing at Ash Keep. She understood it the way she understood most things, not from conversations she was invited into, but from the ones that continued while people forgot she was in the room. She moved through the keep's spaces with a particular quality of stillness that the ranked members had long since stopped registering. To them, she was furniture. Useful, present, invisible. It was a quality she had spent 6 years cultivating, and tonight she was grateful for it. The second formal dinner had been smaller. Edron, his inner circle, and Aldrich with 2 of his delegate. Elara had served the entire meal alone, refilling cups, replacing platters, moving along the wall the way candlelight moves, noticed only when absent. She heard everything. Aldrich's proposal was elegant, she had to admit. 3 Western lordships unified under a single compact, willing to formally align with Iron Vale in exchange for shared border rights along the river territory. On the surface, it was practical, even generous. Beneath the surface, and Elara had developed a talent for the beneath of things, it was a slow encirclement. Each border shared with an Aldrich allied domain was a border Edron, no longer fully controlled. Edron had said almost nothing for the first hour of dinner. He ate with the same contained economy he did everything else, and he listened with a specific quality of attention that Elara had noticed in him from that first corridor encounter, complete, unbroken, giving nothing back. Aldrich filled the silence with charm, with anecdotes from the western reaches, with a particular kind of performative openness that seemed designed to make Edron's restraint look like coldness by comparison. It was working on the delegates. Not on Roe, who sat to Edron's right, with the expression of a man watching a card game he's already solved. Not on Sorn, who had positioned himself standing near the far door, arms crossed, watching Aldrich the way a dog watches a strange dog cross its yard. And not, Elara suspected, on Edron himself. But the compact was real. The 3 allied lordships were real. The leverage was real. She was clearing the last of the dinner platters when Aldrich caught her near the sideboard. Not physically. He simply spoke quietly as she passed close enough to hear. "You serve well," he said, low, meant only for her. "Do they treat you well?" Elara set the platter on the sideboard without pausing. "I have everything I need, my lord." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him then, because she'd learned that sometimes a direct look closed a conversation faster than looking away. His eyes were green, warm, careful, the eyes of a man who had learned that paying attention to overlooked people was a useful tool. She wasn't offended by it. She simply catalogued it. "I'm well," she said. "Thank you." She walked back to the wall. She did not look at the head of the table. But she heard, in the quality of the silence from that direction, something shift. The 3rd day brought an unexpected development. Mira found Alara in the linen storage room mid-morning, folding tablecloths with the focused attention she gave every task. No one was watching. Mira was breathing slightly faster than usual. Aldrich Vane requested something unusual, Mira said, closing the door behind her. Alara folded a corner. What? He asked the steward if the serving girl from the council dinners could be assigned to the river courtyard. He wants to take his meals there today, wants the same staff. The tablecloth settled into a neat rectangle. Alara set it on the pile. He requested me specifically, by description. Auburn hair, gray dress. Mira's expression was somewhere between worried and fascinated. The steward said yes. Apparently, Edrin didn't object. Alara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard's riverside willow, a low sound like breath. Did Edrin know? She asked. Ro told him this morning. Mira paused. He didn't say anything. That, Alara thought, was information. She served Aldrich's midday meal in the river courtyard alone. It was a gray morning. The sky the color of old pewter, the air carrying the clean, sharp smell of coming rain. The courtyard's stone benches held patches of moss at their edges. A young willow grew in the corner near the river gate, too slender yet to cast real shade, its trailing branches so green they almost looked painted. Aldrich sat with the easy posture of a man on holiday, cloak pushed back from his shoulders, a cup of warm cider in his hand. He watched her set out the bread and cheese and cold sliced meat without the impatience she'd learned to expect from Ray. Sit, he said. I don't sit with guests, my lord. I'm not asking as your host, he said it lightly. I'm asking as someone with a question. Alara stood with the wooden tray held at her side. She waited. He looked at her with that same careful attention. Not the measuring look Edrin used, which stripped things to their function, but something more curious, more human perhaps. How long have you been at Ashkeep? 6 years. Born elsewhere, raised in the valley settlements. My parents died when I was 16. She said it the way she always said it, not as a wound, but as a fact. It had been a wound once. It was a scar now. Different things. No lordship affiliation. Unranked. He nodded as though she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. Unranked and without standing. He wasn't being cruel. He was being precise. And they keep you here anyway. Why? Because I'm useful, she thought. Because I ask nothing and require little and move through the spaces between power without disturbing it. Because I learned early that invisibility is its own kind of shelter. I work hard, she said. Aldrich smiled at that genuinely, she thought. You're careful, he said. There's a difference. He said nothing else. She served out the rest of the meal and returned to the kitchen with the empty tray and the specific feeling of having been examined by someone who was good at it. That evening, the thing happened that changed everything. The inner courtyard at dusk was used by the keep's ranked members for informal gathering, conversation, the occasional game of bones, the low social rituals of hierarchy that Alara normally skirted at the edges of, carrying wine and removing cups and existing in the peripheral spaces. She was crossing from the kitchen passage to the storage corridor when she saw Aldrich across the courtyard, standing with 2 of his delegates near the eastern arch. He saw her at the same moment, and he raised his cup slightly, a small gesture meant only for her, and smiled. It was nothing. It meant nothing except that Alara, in the single unguarded second that followed, smiled back. Not performed, not careful. Just a real smile. The kind that moves through you before your careful self can edit it. The kind that changes your whole face and is visible from across a courtyard. And apparently, as she understood 1/2 second later, from the doorway of the great hall where Edrin Vale was standing. She felt his gaze, the way you feel a fire from across a room. Not the warmth, but the heat, the particular radiation of something that burns. She turned her head slowly, because something in her instincts, the ones that hadn't managed to give her rank but had apparently kept everything else, told her to turn slowly, not to flinch. He was standing in the doorway with a cup in his hand and Ro at his shoulder. And his face was the same face it always was, composed, still, entirely controlled, except for his eyes. His eyes were on Aldrich Vane for exactly 2 seconds. Then they moved to Alara and stayed. She held his gaze. She did not look away. She did not apologize with her expression the way she'd learned to apologize for existing in rooms she hadn't been explicitly invited into. Something moved across his face. Too fast to name. Too real to miss. Then he turned and went back inside. Ro remained in the doorway for a moment longer. He looked at Alara with an expression she'd never seen from him before. Not the bored danger of his usual face, but something closer to warning, or maybe to fascination. She couldn't entirely tell which. Then he too was gone. Alara stood in the cooling evening air with the smell of river water and wood smoke around her, and the sound of the keep's courtyard conversation continuing unchanged, and she felt her pulse in her throat, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that she had just done something she hadn't fully intended to do. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps the smile hadn't been entirely unplanned. She wasn't sure which possibility frightened her more. Chapter 4. The knock on the kitchen side door came before sunrise. Alara was already awake, already dressed, stoking the main hearth back to life with fresh river birch and 2 blocks of harder wood she'd split herself the previous afternoon. The knock was quiet, which was its own kind of loud at that hour. Nobody knocked quietly on a kitchen door unless they wanted to be heard only by the person they'd come to find. She opened it. Ro stood in the gray pre-dawn, no cloak, arms crossed against the cold, his breath fogging in the still air. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had decided to say something he hadn't entirely approved of himself saying. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't the tone of a command either, which Alara had learned to distinguish carefully, because the difference mattered. She took her shawl from the hook by the door and followed him into the courtyard. The morning was bone cold. The cobblestones held a thin frost that crunched under her boots. The sky above Ashkeep was just beginning to separate from black into the particular dark blue that means dawn is coming but hasn't committed yet. Ro walked with his hands loose at his sides, which for him was the posture of a man at ease, but never unarmed. He led her to the far wall where the keep's inner courtyard met the old riverside garden, long gone wild. Nothing left but frost-killed herb stalks and the bones of old stone planters. Nobody would come here this early. He stopped. He looked at the dead garden for a moment. "The smile last night," he said. Alara waited. Was it deliberate? She considered lying. She was capable of it. But something about standing in a frost-cold courtyard at dawn with a man who had clearly not slept and was choosing against his own instincts to have this conversation, something about that required honesty. "I'm not entirely sure," she said. Ro made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's the most dangerous kind of thing." He looked at her. "You understand what you did?" I smiled at a guest. "You smiled at Aldrich Vane while Edron was watching." He said it without drama, which made it more serious, not less. In 6 years, I have never seen Edron react to anything the way he reacted to 30 seconds in a courtyard last night. The frost-cold air was very quiet around them. Somewhere beyond the wall, a bird moved through bare branches. "How did he react?" Alara asked. Ro looked at her for a long moment, as though he was measuring not just her question, but her who she was, what she was capable of, whether she was someone who could hold what he was about to say without using it incorrectly. He went inside, Ro said carefully, and he told me to find out everything about Aldrich Vane's specific requests during his stay. Not the political ones, the personal ones. He paused. Including who he'd spoken to privately. Who he'd requested to serve him. The meaning settled over Ilara like the cold. He was already watching, she said quietly. He's been watching since the corridor, Ro said. The spilled broth. He uncrossed his arms. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. What are you telling me for? Another pause. Longer this time. Because Aldrich Vane is not what he appears, Ro said. And I think you already suspect that. And because whatever is happening, whatever Edron feels when he looks at you, which I have no name for, because I've never seen it before, you deserve to have the information to make your own choices. The sky above Ashkeep had shifted from dark blue to pale gray. Dawn arriving with its usual indifference. Ilara looked at the dead garden, at the frost-stiff stalks and the cold stone planters, and the one young willow at the garden's edge, too slender to be bare in winter, still holding its green. What is Aldrich actually here for? She asked. Ro was quiet for 3 full seconds. We don't know yet, he said. That's what frightens me. He left her there with the frost and the pale morning, and a question that had no answer yet. But underneath it, beneath the cold and the uncertainty, and the specific unease of knowing that silver eyes had been tracking her movements since a cup of broth had spilled across a stone floor, underneath all of that was something small and honest. The Lord of Iron Vale had noticed her. Not her usefulness. Not her function. Her. And she had no idea yet whether that was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her, or the beginning of something she hadn't known to want. She pulled her shawl tighter and went back to light the fires. Chapter 5. The summons came at midday, delivered by the understeward with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to attach meaning to the messages he carried. The Lord requests your presence in the map room. Now. Ilara was elbowed deep in bread dough when he said it. She straightened slowly, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at Berta, who was looking at the wall with the focused attention of someone who had decided very deliberately not to have an opinion about anything happening in her kitchen. I'll need to wash my hands, Ilara said. Of course, said the understeward, in the tone of a man who had not expected her to be this calm about it. She washed her hands. She removed her apron. She smoothed her gray dress and checked that her braid was secure, and walked behind the understeward through the keep's corridors with the same steadiness she brought to every task that frightened her, which was the only steadiness she trusted. The map room was on the keep's second level, east side, a room she had cleaned but never been inside while anyone occupied it. It was smaller than she'd expected, not the grand council chamber, but something more functional. Its walls hung with territorial maps inked on stretched hide. A large table at the center covered in weighted parchments, and the small carved markers the keep used to track border movements. Iron candlesticks. The smell of old leather and candle wax and something else beneath it. River birch and the particular outdoor scent of a man who had ridden that morning and not entirely lost it yet. Edron was standing at the table when she entered. Not sitting, standing, looking at a map with one hand resting flat on the table's edge, the other at his side. He didn't look up immediately. The understeward closed the door behind her. Ilara stood. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She kept her breathing even. Then Edron looked up, and the thing that happened in that first second of eye contact was something she had no category for. Not threat. Not assessment. Not the particular blankness he turned on most people in most rooms. Something more direct than any of those. Something that felt uncomfortably like being seen. Sit, he said. There was one chair near the table's corner. She sat. He remained standing, which was clearly deliberate. Not to intimidate, she thought, but because he was the kind of man who thought better on his feet and didn't know how to stop performing function long enough to simply be in a room with another person. "Aldrich Vane requested you again this morning," he said, "for the noon meal in the river courtyard." "I wasn't told," Elara said. I redirected the request. His voice was flat, conveying no apology and no explanation. "You won't be serving his private meals." She looked at him carefully. "My lord, if the guest requested." I'm aware of what he requested. Something in his tone didn't shift exactly, but it compressed slightly, like a rope pulled 1 degree tighter. "I'm telling you what I've decided." Elara was quiet for a moment. In the courtyard below, she could hear the distant sound of training, the rhythmic thud of wooden practice staves, someone calling a count. Normal life, continuing in its normal rhythms, entirely unaware of this room. "May I ask why?" she said. The question cost her something. She felt it leave her, the careful neutrality she maintained with ranked members, the practiced smallness. She asked it anyway because 6 years of not asking had built up a pressure behind her ribs that she was apparently done ignoring. Adron looked at her with those silver eyes and said nothing for long enough that she was certain he was going to simply end the conversation, send her back to the kitchen, return to his maps. Then he said, "Because I don't trust his interest in you." "You don't trust his interest in a kitchen servant?" "I don't trust anything about Aldrich Vane." He said it the way he said most things, without performance, without softening. But there was something beneath the words, something that moved the way a river runs beneath ice, present and invisible, including his reasons for being here. Elara folded her hands in her lap. Rose said, "You don't know what he really wants." Something crossed Edron's face. Quick, unguarded. The expression of a man who has just learned that his second has been having conversations he wasn't informed of. He filed it away visibly, the way someone pockets a thing to return to later. "What did Ro tell you?" he asked. "That Aldrich isn't what he appears, that his reasons for the third meeting might not be the political ones he's presenting." She paused. "And that you'd been watching me since the corridor." The silence in the map room was the quality of silence that belongs to honest things said out loud for the first time. Edron did not confirm it. He did not deny it. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has survived many difficult rooms by refusing to flinch inside them. "You're not afraid," he said. Not a question. An observation carrying within it something that might have been, she wasn't sure, recognition. "I've been afraid for a long time," Elara said quietly. "I've just learned not to let it change what I say." Something in him, barely visible, a fraction of movement in the jaw, a shift in the silver eyes, responded to that like a lock that had heard a key and wasn't sure yet whether to turn. He looked back at the map. He moved one of the carved border markers 2 inches to the left, a gesture that seemed more habitual than purposeful. Then he said, without looking at her, "Stay away from Aldrich Vane's private hours. You can serve the formal dinners. Nothing outside the formal settings. And if he requests otherwise—" "He won't." The certainty in it was absolute. "I've made my position clear." Elara stood. She smoothed her dress. She looked at the map on the table, the wide spread of Iron Vale territory, the border markers, the river line that separated it from Ashfen lands in the west. She looked at his hand, still resting on the table's edge, and the iron ring on his right hand that marked his rank, worn smooth at the edges from years of wear. "My lord," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever Aldrich Vane is here for." She chose her words carefully, because she was a woman who understood that words once released cannot be reclaimed. "I don't think it's only the border compact." His eyes sharpened. Not in suspicion. In attention. "What did you observe?" he asked. And the question was different from everything that had come before it. It was the question of a man who had just looked at furniture and noticed it was something else entirely. "He watched you during the council dinners," she said. Not the way a rival watches, more like a man who is waiting for a specific moment. And when you didn't react to his proposals the way he expected, he adjusted. He started paying attention to the people around you instead of to you directly. She paused. He is looking for something or someone. And I don't think the border compact is anything but a reason to be inside these walls. The map room was very quiet. Adrian stared at her with an expression she had no name for, not because it was unreadable, but because she had never been looked at quite this way, as though she had just become, in the space of a few sentences, an entirely different kind of thing than what he had previously categorized her as. "How long have you been watching this carefully?" he said. 6 years, she said simply. "There isn't much else to do when you're invisible." She left the map room with steady hands and a heartbeat that was anything but steady, and she walked back to the kitchen through the keep's cold corridors, thinking about border markers moved 2 inches to the left, and silver eyes that had watched her since a cup of broth had spilled on a stone floor, and the particular way a lock sounds when a key has found it, but neither party ready yet to turn. Mira came to her that night with mud on her boots and fear in her eyes. Elara was in the small room she'd occupied for 6 years, a servant's room off the East Passage, barely wide enough for a cot and a chest, and a single shelf where she kept 3 things. A folded letter from her mother, written the year before she died, the ink faded to barely visible. A small carved wooden sparrow someone had left outside her door in her first winter at Ashkeep, with no note, which she'd kept because it was the only gift she'd ever received without a reason attached, and a tallow candle stub that she lit on evenings when the dark felt heavier than usual. The candle was lit. The knock came soft. "Something is wrong," Mira said, closing the door behind her. Her curly hair was loose, her cloak still on, smelling of cold air and river water and damp earth. "I went to find Sorn. I had a message for him from the steward, and instead I found 2 of Aldrich's delegates in the lower passage, the old one below the east door." Elara sat up on her cot. "What were they doing?" "I don't know. They weren't talking. They were measuring." Mira pulled her cloak tighter. One of them had a cord stretched between 2 points in the wall. The other was making marks on a piece of parchment. The cold in the room was different now, less physical, more the cold of something understood. "The lower passage runs beneath the east wing," Elara said slowly. "Below the stores, below the armory annex," Mira said, "and below the inner guard post." They looked at each other. Elara stood. She crossed to the chest at the foot of her cot and lifted the lid, pulling out the heavier shawl she kept there, the one she wore for cold outdoor work. Dark wool. Anonymous. "Did they see you?" "I don't think so. I pulled back before they turned." "Did you tell Sorn?" "I couldn't find him. I came to you." Elara thought about the map room, about carved markers moved 2 inches to the left, about Edrin's voice saying, "I don't trust anything about Aldrich Vane," with the flatness of a man stating a mathematical certainty, about Roe in the frost-dark dawn saying, "We don't know yet what he's really here for, and that's what frightens me." She pulled the shawl over her shoulders. "I need to find Roe." "Elara." Mira caught her arm. "If Aldrich's people see you, then I'll be a servant who got turned around in the lower corridors." She said it with a steadiness she was mostly performing. But performance maintained long enough becomes a kind of truth. "I've been invisible in this keep for 6 years. I know how to use it." She found Roe in the armory corridor 20 minutes later, returning from a perimeter check with 2 of the inner guard. She didn't call out. She simply appeared at the corridor's edge and held his gaze for long enough that he understood, with the particular intelligence of a man trained to read environments, that she was there on purpose and it mattered. He told the guards to continue. He came to her. She told him in 9 sentences. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew it was serious. Roe interrupted nearly everything. When she finished, he looked at the wall beside them for 2 seconds, his jaw tight. "Show me the passage," he said. She led him down through the east doors, through the low door at the back behind the oil barrels, into the lower passage, a service corridor that predated most of the keep's current construction, its walls rough stone, the ceiling low enough that Ro had to angle his shoulders. The torches here were unlit. She carried a candle stub from the storeroom. Its light moved across the stone walls in small orange arcs. They found the marks near the second support column. Small, precise, made in chalk, which would wipe away without trace by morning, but legible to someone who understood what they were looking at, which Ro apparently did, because the sound he made when he crouched beside the column was the sound of a man confirming a fear he had hoped was wrong. "Structural mapping," he said quietly. "They're charting load-bearing points." He stood, his voice when it came controlled, in the specific way of a man suppressing urgency. "The East Wing's internal guard post shifts at midnight. There are 14 minutes between the patrol's exit and the gate closing. Whoever drew these marks knows exactly which wall, if compromised, gives access to the inner corridor during those 14 minutes. The candle flame wavered. "This isn't a border compact visit," Ilara said. "No." Ro looked at her in the low light. "It never was." He was already moving back toward the passage's entrance. "I need to reach Edron." "Ro?" She said it quietly, but it stopped him. If Aldrich realizes his delegates were seen, he won't have time to, Ro said. Then, with the look of a man revising something he'd previously underestimated, "You did well finding me instead of confronting them yourself." "I'm not a knight," she said. "I know what I am and what I'm not." He looked at her for a moment, that same measuring look he'd given her in the frost-dawn courtyard, but warmer now, resolved in some direction. "You're the reason we have 14 minutes of warning," he said. "That's not nothing." He disappeared up the passage. The candlelight shrank behind him. Ilara stood in the lower dark with the smell of cold stone and old wood around her, and she thought about chalk marks on a wall and a man who smiled with perfect warmth while his delegates measured the bones of another man's house. And she thought that she had been right. What Aldrich Vane wanted had never been a border compact. What Aldrich Vane wanted was inside these walls, and she was beginning to develop a terrible suspicion about exactly what it was. She climbed back up to the east passage, back to her small room, back to the guttered stub of her tallow candle, which had burned down to almost nothing in her absence. She lit it again. She sat on the edge of her cot and looked at the carved wooden sparrow on the shelf and thought about the sound a lock makes when a key has found it. Then she thought about the 14 minutes and what could happen in 14 minutes if nobody was watching. She did not sleep. The keep shifted at midnight. Ilara felt it the way she felt most things at Ashkeep. Not through rank or trained instinct, but through 6 years of sleeping lightly in a stone room that conducted every sound, every vibration, every change in the rhythm of a building that was also a living thing, inhabited by people whose watchfulness ran deeper than walls. She felt the guard shift in the particular quality of silence that followed the East Passage patrol's footsteps fading. She felt the pause, the gap, the 14 minutes. She was already dressed. She had not undressed. She moved into the corridor with her dark shawl pulled close. No candle. She knew this section of the keep well enough to navigate by the faint torchlight that leaked from the main passage junction 20 feet ahead. Her boots were soft-soled, her steps the steps of a woman who had crossed these stones 10,000 times in 6 years and knew which ones spoke and which ones held their silence. She was 3 steps from her door when she heard it. Not footsteps. Something lower. The specific sound of a door latch lifted with great care by someone who understood that care was necessary. The east storage room, 2 doors down. She stopped, pressed herself against the wall. The darkness in the corridor was complete enough that she was essentially invisible, a quality of the space she had mapped carefully over years. She waited, the way people who cannot fight learn to wait, with absolute stillness and every sense pushed outward. Two figures emerged from the storage room door. Dark clothing, moving with the practiced quiet of men who had done this before in other places. She recognized the build of the taller one. Aldrich's senior delegate, the one Mira had seen in the lower passage with the measuring cord. They turned toward the inner corridor junction, toward the guard post. Elara made the decision the way she made all difficult decisions. Not in a rush of feeling, but in the single cold second where her mind presented the options and the body moved before the fear could object. She turned and ran. Not toward the junction, but back the way she'd come, toward the main stairwell, her boots finding the silent stones automatically, her shawl streaming behind her. She reached the stairwell. Went up. Second level, east side. She knocked on the door at the end of the corridor with the sharp triple knock Ro had told her was the night signal, in the frost-on conversation she had held on to like a cord. The door opened in 4 seconds. Edron was awake, fully dressed. The map room's lamp burned behind him, and she understood in a flash that he had not slept either, that Ro had come to him, and the two of them had been in this room waiting, because the chalk marks and the 14 minutes had already told them something was coming. They simply hadn't known the shape of it yet. He looked at her. 1 second. East storage room, she said. 2 men moving toward the inner junction now. He was already past her, moving down the corridor with a speed that was controlled and absolute. And she heard him say one word, Ro's name, low and carrying, and heard Ro's door open from the other direction before Edron had reached the stairwell. Elara stood in the corridor. She should go back to her room. She knew this. There was no role for her in what came next. No rank, no sword, no function in a confrontation between trained fighters and whatever Aldrich's delegates were carrying in their dark clothing through a keep they'd spent 3 days memorizing. She went back to her room. She sat on the cot. She counted her own heartbeat. She got to 37 before she heard the sound. Not violent, not prolonged, but definitive. The particular sounds of something being resolved. 2 voices briefly raised. Then nothing. Then, 20 minutes later, a different sound. Aldrich Vane's voice in the corridor below, no longer performing ease. She wasn't in the room when it happened, but Mira told her everything the next morning, in pieces over the course of an hour while they folded linen in the storage room with the door closed. Aldrich's 2 delegates had been intercepted at the inner junction by Ro, and 3 of the inner guard who had positioned themselves based on Elara's information about the timing. The delegates had been carrying 2 things. A set of skeleton keys fashioned for Ashkeep's specific lock design, which required inside knowledge, which meant Aldrich had a source within the keep, a discovery that was its own separate horror. And a sealed document tube, wax stamped with Aldrich's personal crest. The document inside the tube was not a border compact. It was a transfer order, formal, witnessed, bearing the seals of the 3 Western lordships Aldrich had claimed were his allies. It named a specific asset to be relocated from Iron Vale territory to Ashvin custody upon the completion of a covert extraction. The asset was not a territory. It was not a store of goods or a strategic position. The asset was a person. The name on the transfer order was not Elara's. It was a title she had never heard applied to herself, written in formal keep law language she wouldn't have known how to interpret. But Edron, who had stood in the inner junction and read the document in the torchlight with Ro at his shoulder, had known exactly what it meant. Mira told her this part quietly, watching Elara's face as she said it. "You're not without standing," Mira said. "Or you are here because nobody registered your lineage when you arrived, but the document says..." She paused, pressing her hands flat on the folded linen. "It says you're the last living daughter of the Grey River bloodline, the family that held the Eastern River territories before Iron Vale absorbed them 15 years ago." The storage room was very still. "That's not possible," Elara said. "Your parents, Mira said gently. In the valley settlements. Where did they tell you they came from? She thought about a letter on a shelf, ink faded to barely visible. Her mother's handwriting, careful and small. She had read it so many times she knew every word, but she had never known what the word Griven in the third line referred to. She had assumed it was a place name, a village, something geographic. Gray, she said softly, not a question. Mira nodded. Elara set down the linen she was holding. She sat on the edge of the storage chest. The room around her was the same room it had always been. The same stone walls, the same smell of clean cloth and cedar, the same thin light from the high narrow window. But the room felt different now. The way rooms feel different when the information inside your own head has reorganized itself entirely. Aldrich didn't come for the border compact, she said. No, he came for me, because a living Grey River heir gives him a legal claim to the Eastern River Territory. She heard the words coming out of her own mouth and felt the particular unreality of a person saying true things they haven't had time to believe yet. It's not a territorial agreement he wants, it's legitimacy. My lineage on his documents gives him a claim that 3 allied lordships would recognize. Yes, Mira said quietly. And he thought. She stopped, started again. He thought no one here knew, because no one did. Edron didn't, Mira confirmed. Not until the document. Elara looked at her hands. The flour-roughened knuckles, the sap-stained fingers, the waxed cord calluses from mending boots that were never quite right. The hands of a servant. The hands of a woman who had been invisible for 6 years in a keep that was apparently sitting on top of the most significant fact of her life without knowing it. What happened to Aldrich? She asked. Confined to his guest quarters. His delegates are in the lower cells. Mira met her eyes. Adrian sent the Ashven delegation home at dawn under keep guard escort. He dissolved the meeting. And Aldrich himself? Mira's expression shifted into something careful. Edron wants to speak with him formally, with witnesses. She paused. He also. Mira hesitated in the way of someone delivering a message they weren't sure they were supposed to deliver. He sent word to the kitchen. He wants to see you in the map room after the midday meal. Elara was quiet for a long moment. Outside the small window, the river willows moved in a slow winter wind. The sky was the flat white of a day that cannot decide whether to rain. Somewhere in the keep, in a guest room with a guard outside it, Aldrich Vane was sitting with the ruins of a plan he had spent. She was beginning to understand, possibly years constructing. A plan built on the assumption that a girl with an important bloodline and no knowledge of it was the easiest kind of asset to move. She thought about the smile in the courtyard, his cup raised, her own smile returned before she could edit it. She thought about whether he had cultivated that moment deliberately, whether even the warmth had been a tool, a way of provoking something in the watching eyes at the great hall doorway, creating a distraction while his delegates did their work below. She thought about silver eyes on her face from across a courtyard and the thing that had moved in them that she had not been able to name. She understood it now. It had not been jealousy in the simple sense. It had been the expression of a man watching something he had been quietly and carefully paying attention to for weeks, watching it be noticed by someone whose noticing he trusted exactly as far as he could throw, and feeling for the first time in a long time something that his controlled and contained and folded away interior life had no established procedure for handling. She thought about all of this. Then she picked up the folded linen, set it on the pile, and said, "I'll be there." The map room at midday held different light than it had at their first meeting. Winter sun came through the east-facing window at a low angle, laying a pale rectangle across the floor, and the edge of the table where the territorial maps were still spread, though the carved border markers had been rearranged since she'd last been here. She noticed that automatically. The Eastern River markers had been moved, grouped differently, as though someone had been reconsidering their meaning. Edron was standing at the window. He turned when she entered. and for the first time since she had known him, which was not long in measured days, but felt longer in the way that significant things always compress time. He looked at her without the assessment, without the cataloging efficiency, without the composure that was also a kind of armor. He just looked at her. "Sit," he said. Then immediately, as though catching himself in an old habit, "if you want to." She sat, the chair by the table's corner, same as before. He remained standing but closer to the table this time, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. The particular exhaustion of a man who has not slept and has spent the night hours rearranging his understanding of several things simultaneously. "You knew about your lineage," he said. "I didn't," she said. "Not until Mira told me this morning." He looked at her steadily, processing. "Your parents never told you?" "They called themselves settlers. Valley people." She paused. "My mother's letter mentions the word Gray River once. I thought it was a place." "It is a place," he said quietly. "It's also a name. The Gray River family held the Eastern River territories for 4 generations before." He stopped. The line of his jaw tightened slightly. "Before Iron Vale absorbed the territory." The word absorbed sat between them with everything it contained. "You mean before your father took it," she said. Not accusing, simply accurate. Something moved in his face. "Yes. My parents left. She said they went to the valley settlements, and they never spoke of it, and they died when I was 16. And I walked into Ashkeep 6 years ago because it was the closest place with walls and work." She paused. "I walked into the house that displaced mine, and I cleaned its floors, and I lit its hearths, and I had no idea." The pale winter light moved across the floor between them. "I had no idea either," Edron said. It was the closest thing to an apology she had ever heard from him, which meant it was not phrased as an apology at all, but carried the weight of one. "Aldrich knew," she said. "Aldrich has known for at least 2 years, longer possibly." His voice shifted into the flat register of controlled anger, which on him was more frightening than raised volume. He located the Gray River lineage records when the 3 Western lordships approached him for alliance. He found you here. He understood that if he could extract you and place your name on his documents, he would have a legal claim to the river territories that even the larger northern domains would have to recognize. He used the border compact as cover. He used everything as cover. He used everything as cover. Edron turned back to the window briefly. The charm, the warmth, the carefully managed dinners. He was gathering information about the keep's structure, about the guard rotations, about the cause, about who in this keep I paid attention to. The room was very quiet. He provoked the smile deliberately, Lara said. "In the courtyard." Adrian turned from the window. His silver eyes held hers. "Yes, he wanted my attention on the courtyard while his men were in the lower passage." Another pause, longer. He understood that if he... The sentence stopped. He began again. "He made a calculation about what would hold my attention. He was not entirely wrong about the calculation. He was wrong about everything else." It was the most she had ever heard him say at once, and it cost him something. She could see it. The particular effort of a man who has lived for a long time behind the armor of his own restraint, choosing deliberately to say a true thing rather than a safe one. "I'm a Gray River heir in Iron Vale territory," she said carefully. "What does that mean? Legally, for my situation here?" He held her gaze without flinching. "It means you have a claim I should have acknowledged years ago if I had known. It means you are not a servant." He moved to the table, reached for one of the parchments near the Eastern River markers, and turned it to face her. "It means if you choose to pursue it, you have standing, territorial rights. The Gray River Eastern holdings were absorbed, but not legally dissolved under keep law. My father used force of dominance, not proper legal compact, which means..." Which means the territories are technically still Grey River, she said slowly. Yes. She looked at the map, at the river line, at the markers grouped at the eastern border, which she now understood he had been rearranging through the night. You've been looking at this all night, she said. Yes. Because you're trying to determine how to make it right. The silver eyes held something she recognized now. Had recognized since the courtyard, since the corridor, since the cup of broth on a cold stone floor. She just hadn't had the right name for it. It wasn't jealousy, and it wasn't possession, and it wasn't the cataloging assessment of a man measuring function. It was something older and less managed than any of those things. The particular expression of someone who has found, unexpectedly and inconveniently and entirely without plan, a person they cannot stop thinking about. I'm trying to determine many things, he said quietly. She looked at the map for a long moment. Then she looked at him, at the iron ring worn smooth, at the exhaustion around his eyes, at the man underneath the Lord Paramount, which she was beginning to suspect very few people had ever been in the same room with. What happened to Aldrich? She asked. He leaves at dawn tomorrow under formal escort. I've sent dissolution notice to the 3 allied lordships. His compact collapses without the Grey River legitimacy he promised them. His jaw tightened. He will face council judgment for the attempted extraction. That process will take time, but he will not be returning to Ashkeep. And the source inside the keep, the one who gave him the lock designs. A darker pause. Soren is handling it. She nodded. She trusted the flatness in his voice on that subject, trusted that it would be handled and handled correctly, and that she did not need to know the specifics. Elara, he said. It was the second time he had said her name. The first had been in a corridor with a tray, and a spilled cup, and 6 years of invisibility between them. This time it was different. Deliberate, held, carrying something he was not yet saying directly, but was building toward with the careful precision of a man who does not say things unless he means them permanently. She looked at him. Whatever you decide, he said, about the territories, about your standing, about this. He didn't gesture. He didn't need to. The word encompassed the map room and the winter light, and the two of them in it and everything that had accumulated in the space between them over the course of 10 days that had felt like a different kind of time entirely. I will not make the choice for you. I've had enough of choices being made for Grey River blood by Iron Veil hands. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she had ever heard from power. I know, she said quietly. And for the first time in the map room she smiled. Not the courtyard smile, not the unguarded flash that had started everything. A different kind. Slower. Chosen. He looked at her smile with the expression of a man who has not known for a long time how to want something and is only now remembering how that feels. Outside, the winter sky had made its decision. Rain had begun to fall on Ashkeep, soft and unhurried, covering the cobblestones, and the young willow in the courtyard corner, and the frost-killed stalks of the old garden, in the same patient sound. The rain fell for 3 days. It washed Ashkeep the way time washes old wounds, slowly, completely, without asking permission. By the 3rd morning, the river had risen a foot against the lower wall stones, and the young willow in the garden corner wore the wet on its trailing branches like something earned. Aldrich Vane left at dawn on the 2nd day, as Idrun had promised. Elara did not watch him go. She was in the kitchen, her hands in bread dough, doing the work she had always done. But something about the doing of it had changed, the way the same road changes when you finally know where it leads. She was not invisible anymore. She had not chosen invisibility in a long time. She had simply forgotten, somewhere in 6 years of cold corridors and thin broth and other people's fires, that invisibility had been a choice at all. Mira stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him ride out through the keep's main gate, with his remaining delegate and 6 of Iron Veil's inner guard flanking them. And then she came inside and said nothing, which was how Alara knew she understood everything that needed to be understood. The source inside the keep, the one who had given Aldrich the lock designs and the guard rotation schedules, was a junior steward named Corey, who had been in Aldrich's pay for 8 months, recruited through a debt he had not known how to escape. Soren handled it with the particular quietness Soren brought to all difficult things. Corey was stripped of his rank and sent to the border settlements under formal exile compact. Alara heard about it through Mira 3 days after it happened and felt no satisfaction in it. Only the tired recognition that people do desperate things for desperate reasons, and the world produces consequences regardless. They kept moving. The fires burned. The bread rose. On the 5th day after the rain, Edron came to the kitchen. Not summoned by duty, not announced by the understeward. He simply appeared in the kitchen doorway at the early hour when Alara was alone, before Berta arrived, stoking the main hearth back to life with river birch and hard wood, the way she had done every morning for 6 years. She heard him before she saw him, the specific quality of presence that preceded him, the pressure drop in a room that she had learned to recognize as distinctly his. She did not startle. She finished setting the second block on the fire and stood and turned. He was holding something, a folded document sealed in black wax with the iron veil crest. He crossed the kitchen, which looked very different with a Lord Paramount in it, smaller and warmer, and somehow more real, and set it on the worktable beside the dough she'd already begun. Formal acknowledgement of Grey River lineage, he said, witnessed by Roe and 2 senior council members. Keep legal, permanently recorded. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the document without touching it. The Eastern River Territories, she said, remain under Iron Veil management for now, with Grey River interest formally recognized. He said it carefully, which meant he had thought carefully about how to say it. There are arrangements that need to be worked through properly. Legal compact, council review, time. But your name is on the record. Your blood is acknowledged. Nobody can use it without your knowledge again. She looked at the document, at the black wax seal, at her own name written on the outside in handwriting. She recognized, angular, precise, no wasted motion, as his. She thought about a letter on a shelf, ink faded to almost nothing. Her mother's careful handwriting. The word "griven" in the 3rd line that she had read 100 times without understanding. She thought about her mother choosing the valley settlements, choosing silence, choosing a life built on the deliberate erasure of a name. Not from shame, but from survival. From the knowledge that some things need to be buried to endure. The name had endured anyway. It had walked into Ashkeep in worn-out boots and lit its hearths for 6 years without knowing what it carried. She picked up the document. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the full unperformed way. Not the thank you of a servant to rank, but the thank you of one person to another who has done a right thing at a cost. He nodded. He looked at the bread dough on the table, at the hearth fire she'd built, at the kitchen around her, taking it in with the same total attention he gave every room, but slower this time. Less like assessment and more like seeing. "You don't have to do this work anymore," he said, "if you don't want to." "I know," she said. "But you'll be here in the morning anyway." It wasn't quite a question. "I'll be here," she said. "The fires don't light themselves." Something crossed his face. That fraction of movement she had learned to read now. The thing that happened in him when he was feeling something he hadn't built a procedure for. It was the closest he came to warmth expressed outwardly. And it was enough. More than enough, for a woman who had learned to find shelter in the spaces between things. He left the kitchen without another word, which was exactly right, because some things are completed by silence better than by speech. Mira was the one who noticed it first. The way Mira noticed most things, quickly, with great feeling, and with absolutely no intention of keeping it to herself. "He comes to the kitchen," she said 3 weeks later, folding linen with aggressive precision, every morning before anyone else arrives. He checks the hearths, Ilara said. He checks you, Mira said. Elar Paramount of Iron Vale comes to the kitchen at dawn to make sure you are well and present, and she set down the linen. Are you truly going to pretend this is a normal thing that happens? Elara was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I'm not pretending. Mira looked at her with the expression of someone waiting. It's slow, Elara said finally. It's careful. It's two people who don't entirely know how to do this, doing it anyway. She paused. That's all I know how to say about it right now. Mira picked up the linen. That's enough, she said softly. That's actually plenty. Spring came to Ashkeep the way it always did in the north. Late, reluctant, and then suddenly everywhere at once. The young willow in the old garden grew 3 feet in the first warm weeks. The frost-killed herb stalks and the stone planters came back. Not all of them. Not the ones too far gone. But enough. Rosemary. Thyme. A stubborn sage that pushed through a crack in the planter's stone edge, as though it had been waiting patiently all winter for permission. Ro found Elara in the garden one afternoon in early spring, her sleeves rolled up, her hands in the earth of a new planter she'd asked the groundskeeper for, and received without question, because she was no longer the kind of person whose requests were ignored. Ro stood at the garden's edge, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has come to say something, and is organizing how to say it. You saved 14 minutes, he said. She looked up. You told me that already. I know. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the new planter, at the turned earth, at the herbs beginning to take. I wanted to say it again because the council reviewed the incident formally last week, and the record shows that the interception happened based on information provided by. He stopped, started again. The record shows your name as the source. She sat back on her heels. Does that change anything? It changes the record, he said, which is the only place some things ever become real. He left her with the earth and the spring light and the small, persistent rosemary beginning to root. She looked at the garden, at the work her hands had done, and the work still ahead, at the old stone walls of Ashkeep around her, which had been many things to her over 6 years. Shelter, prison, backdrop, home, and were now simply the place where she lived. The place where her name was on a record. The place where a man with silver eyes came to the kitchen before dawn and didn't say much and didn't need to. The carved wooden sparrow was still on the shelf in her room. She had never found out who left it. She had decided sometime in the long winter that it didn't matter. Some gifts don't require origins to be real. Some things endure not because they were built to last, but because the person who found them chose to keep them. She pressed her hands back into the earth. The rosemary smelled clean and sharp and alive. Above the walls of Ashkeep, the sky was the particular blue that only comes after a very long winter. Wide and clear and certain.